Now we're on limited time, so I think we'll get started with Q&A just while we wait for the others to join in. Maybe we'll go straight. James, you just mentioned a moment ago in the feed there that you had a great story about biological activity in the soil, or beneficial insects it was. Do you want to expand on that?
Yeah, there was a question about if we had seen an increase in beneficial insects, and it's kind of funny because when you finally get to the point where you're in a regenerative program, you start learning that if you kill all of the food source for the beneficial insects, you never build any beneficial insects. And we had a lygus infestation fairly early on in our cotton crop. In fact, most of the Southwest had lygus hit all at the same time. And my crop consultant that I work with that helps me with irrigation scheduling and pest control and things like that. He came in and he said, I saw this lygus yesterday at another farm. I found it here. I think we need to spray X. And so he wrote out his recommendation and he left. And the next week, I believe it was on Tuesday, he called me and he asked me how spraying was going. Now, mind you, I've got to get across 1,200 acres of cotton. And this is amongst irrigations and everything else. So timing is kind of crucial on getting across it. So he called back on Thursday, asked if I had everything sprayed. I told him that I had. He actually showed up Friday. We had a Zoom conference with AEA that morning. And I had already primed the AEA team that I had not told him anything. So we went through our Zoom meeting and he left and asked again right on the way out. He said, you did spray everything. And I said, got it all sprayed. Absolutely. About an hour later, he comes storming back in the office and he slams the door open and he says, I thought you said you sprayed everything. And I said, I did spray everything. Did you find any lygus? And he said, I found 0 lygus, but all the beneficials are still alive. And I said, that's because I didn't spray what you told me to. Thank you very much. It was just a very slight foliar management technique that AEA brought to the table and said, this is what we feel you ought to spray. Mostly it was the mag sulfate, the molybdenum, and the boron mix again, and took care of the lygus and wiped them out. I'll tell you, one of the most sad guys around here is my Helena Chemical sales rep, because he doesn't buy me as many lunches as he does anymore. But with the money that I've saved, I'm able to buy my own lunches.
I've got a similar story for you. I just last week hosted the ag consultants out in my field to look at vine mealybug. And they were talking about, the use of Movento, which is actually quite effective. It's a systemic against vine mealybug. And I said, well, I have a huge increase in the population of my mealybug destroyers. And he goes, well, if you use Movento, you won't need to have mealybug destroyers. And I said, but yeah, if I have mealybug destroyers, I won't need to use Movento.
Nice one. All right, well, let's jump to a question for John while we're still waiting for the others, just working out some tech issues. John, there was a question for you around how long-lasting is a foliar application of nutrients to achieve level 1 and 2 in your pyramid through balancing plant nutrition if the soil is essentially deficient or the biology isn't functioning effective yet. So I might just paste the question into the chat feed just so everyone can get a read of it. I'll just do that now. Just in the stage chat there, John, if you can see that question written.
Yep, got it. Thank you. So the answer is it depends. And the simple answer is that the unhealthier a soil and plant ecosystem is, the more degraded it is, the less time a foliar application will remain effective. So I've seen the effects wear off as quickly as we put on a foliar application, the crop becomes resistant to a given disease or insect, and that effect starts maybe 24 hours after application, and it lasts for 2 or 3 days, and then it's gone. So in some cases, it might only last 2 or 3 days. That's very uncommon, It's most common to have an effectiveness window in the range of about 10 to 20 days. And for really healthy soils with good microbiology, the effect can last as much as 6 weeks. So again, there's broad variability based on crops and environment and soil health and so forth, but those are kind of the general ranges that we've observed.
Sure, thanks, John. And look, while we're on the topic of foliar application, another question here around foliar application to broadacre crops. And basically the question is, wouldn't weeds benefit from foliar treatments as well?
The brief answer is that the nutrients and the nutritional balance that the crop needs to be healthy is usually quite different from the nutritional balance that the weeds need to be healthy. So the answer is usually no. If you put on a foliar application that is designed and optimized for the crop, it will not be optimized for the weeds. So usually it will actually make the weeds less healthy rather than more healthy. And again, there's variation depending on which species you're talking about and which context. But as a general rule of thumb, I would expect that to be the case.
Yeah, fantastic. Thanks for the clarification. That is good. All right, we'll have a bit more of a look through while the others still waiting on the others, but that's okay. Let's go. So, John, we might stick another one in here for you. Question is, sorry, mate, you've got most of the questions. Is it cheating the system to apply Tanio products to achieve ISR or SAR expected for level 4?
The answer is it's not possible. You cannot skip. You cannot be at level 1 and then jump up to level 4. You have to go through every stage on the pyramid to get there. Now, that can happen fairly rapidly. If you manage it really well, that can, on some crops, that could happen if you manage it closely as rapidly as within a couple of weeks. But it's much more likely that that process would take a few months to occur. And so the answer is you're not likely to really skip through that process. If there's...
And John, if I could add to that, you know, the whole idea of cheating the system or gaming the system, most of the systems I've seen are so degraded. I'll cheat, I'll game, I'll do anything I can do to get that system back into homeostatic balance as fast as possible.
If all the questions through are coming from me, then I have one for both James and Greg. And the question is, what, as you've gone through this transition process over the last couple of years, or in your case, James, over the last year or so, what have you observed or experienced that really caught you by surprise? What was unexpected?
No, that's what I was kind of.
I think
Are we still on, or did we freeze up?
probably what surprised me the most was that the system actually does function. We've been just conditioned over and over. We've been farmed as the farmers that we just can't do this without the chemicals. And you know, that thing of applying on the maggots, the ligus, and then after we saw it on the ligus, we were able to use it on thrip, and to see that this balanced nutrition worked pretty much across the board on every one of our crops. Now, we didn't win every one of the battles that we had across the season. And I guess that's where my humility comes in and says, did I make mistakes? Yes. You know, Greg's a couple of years ahead of this, and he talks about how life has gotten easier. I'm still at that ball of stress moment that a lot of guys in transition are, of saying, are we doing the right thing? You know, Greg, there was a point, well, I was with a previous bank, and I'll throw it out there anymore because I'm not in that system anymore. But we used to borrow all of our money through the farm credit system. Mm-hmm. And I had to hide regenerative. I had to hide all of these things. So they expected us to be sustainable, but regenerative was a absolute, they didn't want to hear anything about it. And I hid all of that. I hid so much in my budgets. I had to do all of these things that to keep them from seeing what we were doing. And I actually got with another bank that was young. They were trendy. They were, and I'll throw their name out there. It's Ag America Lending. I think the oldest guy in the whole bank is like 35 years old. They tweet constantly about regenerative agriculture. They tweet constantly about organic production. And I immediately, when I saw one of their tweets on Twitter, I called them and said, hey, I didn't disclose this whenever I filled out my application, but we're on a regenerative farming program now. And boom, I think I shot up like 10 points automatically in their eyes. And it changed the way that they viewed me. They don't scrutinize the regenerative inputs that we put in. And, one of the things that I didn't say whenever I kind of threw out my costs in there, a lot of those costs, we hope that the increased cost in what we called fertilizer there being above budget, we feel like that's probably going to reduce over time, because there's a lot of expenses that we've put into the soil trying to overcome 50 or 60 years of chemical dependencies. And I think we're not going to be at that level. We're at that level because I told my AEA reps and my consultants that as far as it is, I have no budget. We're going to throw the kitchen sink at it because I want to be as far up the pyramid as fast as I can.
So for me, I think the most surprising thing, that's actually sort of a twofold answer. The first is, for as many mistakes as we've made, as long as we kept to a basic concept of feeding the plant, supporting the biology, supporting the nutrition, how forgiving nature is. I mean, I know when I walk out there, the vines are like shaking their leaves at me going, oh, you kind of got it right, but you really didn't get it right. And it's just the system. The more you support the system, the more it kind of compensates for you. The other side of that is, having a scientific background, I want to know exactly why everything's happening and exactly what it is. And it's way more complex than I ever imagined. And I think the lesson I'm learning now is I still want to know everything, why it's happening, what the causal relationship is. But if you understand how the system works, you can just step back and just trust the system, and realizing that knowing at that level is probably more of an academic exercise than it is a necessary exercise.
Right. Thanks, Greg. Well, look, we've got Dennis and Steve on the line now. So I've got a question here for you both. Are microbe foods important, and what food sources are best?
Yeah, and sorry about our video, guys. Microfood is very important, especially when we first get started, keeping them alive and building them within that soiled environment. As we see, the best food for the plant is root exudates, as John talked about, and basically doing everything we can to get those exudates for that plant to photosize and go back into build that biology and feed that biology within the soil environment. But, when we have low organic matter and sandy soil and no food, we need to support that biology until that plant is producing those exudates in the soil environment. So I look at, your kelp products, your fish products, your humate products, all are great products. AEA has a complete line of those products to support our biology. That's one of the reasons why our products function so well, is because of the food and the support that AEA provides to keep them alive. It makes us perform better, and I think that we help AEA perform better. So it's a nice marriage for us.
Yes, it's like a relay race where we got this baton handoff, and in some situations, I think back to some of the trials we've done, especially with the nitrogen fixing bacteria, where they went with zero. These are conventional no-till farmers, and they decided, no, we're going all in. They did zero nitrogen, and the soil temperatures were 40, 50, and it wasn't until the soil temperatures hit 60, 70 degrees where we saw those nitrogen fixers actually start to do their job. So it's that lag time that we find to be most critical. So depending on your soil type, there's definitely a difference. If you magically have massive amounts of soluble carbon in your soil, less critical. but it takes some time to get to the point where you have that solubility available. So during that transition time, during that baton handoff, is the most critical time until we can get those exudates and get that engine really running and that fire really burning.
Great. And look, a question that kind of feeds off that was, if people are already using compost or compost teas and adding those to the soil, will other inoculums be helpful?
Yeah, and we have a lot of growers that are still using compost tea. The thing I like at the end of the brew on the compost tea, however you're brewing that, to go ahead and when you put that in the tank, to add the biology, the inoculum with known beneficial bacteria, known functions within that. Add those at the end and go ahead and put those out into the soil environment. You know, the one thing I will say, that's as long as you are growing or you understand what you're doing with compost tea, and it is beneficial compost tea that we're putting out there either in the soil environment or as a foliar application. With the diversity and the dynamic of our product, we don't like to brew that in the compost tea because it changes the makeup of that. Depending on food, depending on brew times, depending on oxygen level, it's going to change the makeup of our products, and therefore we say don't try and brew it out, just put it at the end of the brew and apply it to the soil.
Yeah, my kind of take on that is the food, the environment dictates who's going to be there. If I start with compost that may be very, very high quality compost, but what has to happen with that compost? It has to break down. It goes through a thermophilic phase that a lot of those organisms, they're not going to be there anymore. They got burned up, except for those organisms that love that high heat. And you also have a lot of cellulose digesters. Some of those are PGPR, some of those are beneficial fungi for the plant. But a lot of it is we're creating an environment that emphasizes these digesters, which may not necessarily be the ones that we want with the plant. So yes, compost is great, but we've got to kind of keep in mind we're not necessarily going to have that same diversity. We've created an environment that grows out those species, and some of them are great species, some of them are weak species. Without true analysis, it's really hard to tell who's there. But our goal, our input on that is adding those known beneficials, like Dennis said, to the end of this. It's kind of like picking random people off the street and saying, hey, let's play some football versus hiring NFL players. They do the job. That's what they're there to do, and we know they're going to do it.
Yeah, I'd like to add a comment to the whole compost tea thing. I worked with Elaine Ingham. I think she does brilliant work. She does great stuff. But my take on the compost tea is it's actually more food for a healthy system. Where a lot of us are at is we actually need targeted biological systems. We need microbes that are targeted. So when I actually switched to using the soil rescue and the spectrum and that, I got immediate results. I think once the system's in place, if I have an economical source of compost tea, it's great food for a system that's already closer to homeostasis. But until you get there, you sometimes need medicine to get healthy. And to me, that's what a lot of the more targeted biologicals do.
So you view it more as a biostimulant, which I absolutely agree with.
Right. John, do you have any thoughts on compost tea versus inoculums?
Well, obviously, we use the Tineo microbial inoculants on all the crops that we work with for one very simple reason. They are consistently effective. They deliver consistent, repeatable results year after year. Every time we apply them, we can expect to get results. I have yet to find any compost tea that can make that claim. And I think there's a number of reasons for that, perhaps beyond the scope of this conversation. But I think there's also a need for inoculation simply because some of the organisms that need to be reinoculated and that are delivering these results don't reproduce in compost tea. I mean, the obvious example is mycorrhizal fungi. If you want to propagate mycorrhizal fungi, you have to have a living root system, which doesn't happen in compost production. And so there is a need to apply targeted appropriate microbial inoculants, and the evidence is in the results.
Fantastic, thanks. Well, look, let's go to a broader question to throw out to everyone. what is one tip, if you had to pick one tip for a farmer who's about to start their transition, what would that one tip be? So maybe we'll start with James, or who wants to go first? Maybe I won't put you in the hot seat.
I'll go first. That's okay. To say that I just started my journey a year ago would be unfair. To say that I tried to switch to regenerative 4 or 5 years ago, whenever I realized that if I didn't do something on the farm, our yields were going the wrong direction. In 2018, I bought 2,700 gallons of Roundup, but in 2018, I also thought that Roundup was a good thing. I had been convinced by some other people that a little bit of glyphosate use to increase your overall organic matter because you weren't having to till or something like that was probably worthwhile. It actually took a visit. I'm a sizable farm, and so I'm not the biggest fish, but I'm a good sized fish. I do have a lot of people that watch what I do, and I think that there was a reason or maybe God brought Dennis and David Miller. So Dennis Warnicki and David Miller actually visited my farm on a sales trip coming through, and we spent a couple of hours, dug around in the soil, scratched the soil, and David, he's the main consultant that I've worked with at AEA, looked at me quite frankly and said, "You're doing a lot of good things at the wrong time and in the wrong amounts." And why I say I've been my own worst enemy, a good example of that, and going back to compost, after my first adventure with Tainio products, I went to a composting school. I learned how to make compost. I bought a compost turner. We started making thousands of tons of compost. And I was spreading immense amounts of compost on my ground, not understanding that as I increased my potassium levels past the point that the soil and the plants that I was growing wanted, I was increasing my own weed populations because there were certain amounts of weeds, or certain varieties of weeds that liked high potassium, low calcium soils. The main one being field bindweed. So I'm using a lot of glyphosate trying to fix my field bindweed problem, but my field bindweed problem goes back to I was putting too much compost out. So the best thing that I can say to a new guy starting out is find a mentor or find a team or find somebody that's willing to give you some guidance.
Yeah, I completely agree with James on that. I think the one thing you can do is to do research, find other regenerative farmers, hang out with them, listen to podcasts, do whatever it takes until you get that shift in your mindset, that you realize that this is a system that's based on biology. It's not a system that's based on chemistry. And if you go even deeper, there's no such thing as chemistry. It's all electromagnetism, but that's a whole nother conversation. But make that shift. Once you have that shift, it just makes sense and things start to fit. And then you can think rationally, how do I transition from a degraded system that's not working to a functional system that does work?
I suppose I'm happy to go next. I can't believe that you echoed similar sentiment and you said exactly what I was going to say. So I'm not going to change what I was going to say. The first thought that came to mind when you asked the question was this Bible reference quote that is, "My people perish for a lack of knowledge." And what we have observed is the growers who experience who experience the greatest success on this pathway to regenerative agriculture have an active desire for learning. They read, they talk to people, they listen to podcasts, and they're just constantly learning. And specifically, they emphasize and they focus their learning on answering the questions of what are the factors in my crop that help improve my crop's profitability. If I'm growing cotton, is it the number of bolls? Is it the quality of the fiber? What are the exact agronomic factors that influence that, and how can I manage that better? So it is really, I think profitability, the greatest profitability is made or lost based on the knowledge that we either have or don't have, either personally or on our teams.
Yeah, and look, I would reiterate that point in particular from what we see in a lot of our case studies that come through Regen Farming News, is that mindset shift away from chasing yield to chasing profitability is absolutely critical. So I'd reiterate that point. Now, maybe Dennis and Steve, your recommendations, one tip for someone who's just starting out.
Well, I guess the one tip I would give is gather as much information as you possibly can when it comes to soil analysis, plant sap. Get that information, understand, talk to as many, what should I say? Mentors, yeah. That you possibly can, and gather as much information as you possibly can as a grower. Every grower is different. I say this all the time. And so you as a grower have to gather as much information as you possibly can, and then fit that into what works into your agricultural practices. Now, obviously, we want to try and do everything based on those agricultural practices, not to harm what we're trying to do in regenerative agriculture. And that's where we need to depend on these experts that we can trust to help us along that way, to make sure we're implementing each one of these tools as designed. Kind of like Greg talked about with this compost. We think it's a great thing, but we have to look at the compost analysis and our soil analysis and see how that's going to affect us and whether we're going to create excesses or problems based off of that. So information to me, not only based on what we're applying, how we're applying it, and when we're applying it, I think is critical. And I guess that's the thing I preach all the time is get as many opinions as you can and talk to those people and make sure that we're making a well-educated decision based on, like John said, what are we trying to do?
Yeah, knowledge is power. I mean, we had the quote in our presentation that basically summarized the best fertility is the footprints in the field. Just getting out there and evaluating. You've got to look. You've got to try to see what's going on in that farm, in that world around you. Otherwise, you're going to go down some long rabbit holes.
Those are wormholes, Steve.
Oh, sorry. Those are great. So now let's talk about worms.
Nice. So, Greg, James, just on this topic of learning and knowledge sharing, can I ask how important have local farmer peer networks been to both of you in this journey?
James, you want to go?
I guess I'll go first. I gave Greg a chance, but he balked, so I'll jump on that. My grandfather used to have a saying on the wall, and it was actually framed and hanging there for a long time that went, "Never be the first by which the new is tried, nor the last to lay the old aside." And his nickname for me was Hot Shot. Him and I always butted heads. And when I moved into the office and got my own office, I moved that saying because I like to be the early adopter. I like technology. I like to bring things on. So that's just kind of my thing. I've kind of become, in my area anyway, I'm amongst a group of maybe 4 or 5 younger, and I'm probably the oldest of those younger growers that are trying something different, that are going regenerative, that are actually looking at transitions to organic. And the best thing that I can say about trying to get other people to do the right thing is to lead by example. The absolute best thing, just like Greg said, that you can do is when you have a harvest and your harvest is fantastic. We had an AEA field day here on the farm where I brought in multiple other cotton farmers, and I just let them walk in the field and look and ask questions. So I didn't push this on them. I didn't ask them, or tell them that they needed to change their ways. I just presented my own findings and then allowed them to come to me individually and ask those questions. And that seems to be effective, at least for my peer group.
So James, I hope on my presentation when I identified the laggards as your dad question mark, you thought about dear old dad. That's very similar. I don't get a lot of local support. Interestingly enough, the local cooperative extension, the local NRCS are very interested in what we're doing. They are dying to hear something like this, and they don't hear it enough. As James mentioned, I think you need to lead by example. When I first started doing the very first thing I did 8 years ago when I took over the vineyard was stop using glyphosate across the board. Everyone thought I was crazy. Once I got that under control, this valley was 100% glyphosate, disking 4 to 5 times a year for weed control. It's now probably 10% glyphosate. It's just everyone's seen that it works better. So, that's sort of a small victory. As far as the community, my community is a larger community. So, obviously having Tanio advancing eco agriculture, I haven't been as connected with the regenerative farming news. They're a great resource. I am really anxious to do that. I'm also anxious to start utilizing this new resource of Kind Harvest. So I think it's these larger networks. Yeah, we need to back each other up and support each other in this, because we are somewheres in that gap between early innovators and early adopters.
Thank you, Greg. Go, John.
Thanks for the mention of Kind Harvest, Greg. The intention of Kind Harvest is to have a platform to facilitate learning from each other, because all of us have knowledge and information that other people would benefit from, and we can benefit from other people's knowledge. And sadly, the social media world today isn't always a conducive environment to share that information. That was the intention behind Kind Harvest. I'd love for everyone to check it out.
Great, thanks, John. And look, I think that's a really good way to wrap up. We're out of time on the Q&A, so we'll hand back over to Rochelle. But I think that's a really good. I guess the point for the audience here, especially if you're early on this journey, is there are a lot of great resources out there. So we really encourage for this to be, the beginning and get involved. There's lots to learn.